Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a writing coach, a manuscript editor, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one to one with me, and I'm one to one with Matty Dalrymple. She's a podcaster, she's a novelist, she's a very interesting person. And so, Matty, welcome to One to One.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too, and I wanted to tell you, I dipped into one of your novels. I think it was The Sense of Death,
Okay.
and um, you'll be interested in this because it proves that whatever it is you do as a writer is working. Because my wife Cindy and I were out on a drive, and she had to stop somewhere, and she was going to pop the trunk to put something in. And I remember having this thought, "Oh my God, she's going to find the body in there."
Not the trunk.
Yeah, and it was like, that's how effective your writing was, because
Good.
I was able to get into the or you were able to get me into the mind of the villain, and and be able to empathize to the point where um a trunk opens and I'm going, "Oh my God, I'm going to get caught."
Well, that's fun to hear.
Yeah. So talk about, I mean, you write thrillers and you write suspense, and you've got two different characters. So what's the difference between thriller and suspense in your mind, and why two characters, and how are they different?
Well, the underlying question, I think, with thrillers, at least the way I approach it, and those are my Lizzie Ballard thrillers, is the question is the protagonist going to survive the encounter? Whereas with the suspense novels, which are really end up being kind of a mixture of suspense and mystery in that series, those are the Ann Kinnear novels, is more either a who done it or why he done it, or will he get away with it? So it's more, the thrillers are more action oriented. The maybe the suspense and mystery are a little more focused on character motivation. Those are two differences, I think. But the commonality is that what interests me about fiction is to explore stories where there is an extraordinary ability that transforms an ordinary life. And that's kind of the underpinnings of both of those series.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the covers.
Okay.
Um, so Sense of Death is the one that I was talking about,
Yep.
and uh, this is Ann Kinnear. Am I right? Is that your
Yep.
protagonist?
Yep.
And
That's right.
tell us about Ann. And now Sense of Death, if I'm not mistaken, is the first in the series, correct?
Yes, it is.
Which is, well, a lot of people like to start there, so we'll just mention that one.
Yeah, that would be great. This is one where this is, I would say, kind of Ann Kinnear's origin story. But Ann Kinnear is a woman who has the ability to communicate with dead people. At the beginning of The Sense of Death, um, it's not a very extensive ability. She can sense sort of the demeanor of a spirit. Is it a friendly spirit or an unfriendly spirit? And she has a business that's run by her brother based on that ability. So people will hire her. She will um, go to like a house they're thinking of buying, for example, and tell them if there is a spirit there. That's how um, her storyline intersects with the storyline of the person involved in the trunk situation. And then throughout this novel, her ability gradually expands until she has a little bit more of an ability to communicate with the dead people. And then in the subsequent books, her ability advances quite a bit. So she's actually conversing and interacting with the dead people.
So
And
does this reflect your own, I don't know, spiritual proclivities?
well, oftentimes people ask me if I've had these experiences, and I have not myself, although I certainly don't discount the likelihood that other people have. But I think it was more that the idea of having someone who had this one extraordinary ability and everything else in her life is completely normal. Like that's one of the, I'd say, the hallmarks of the Anne books is that it's all handled in a very business-like way. It's not like board supernatural suspense. She has engagements. They sign contracts. Her brother is her business manager. So I try to handle it in a very straightforward way. And yet the ability that Anne and more or less no one else can communicate with dead people opens up great opportunities for suspense and mystery. Because Anne, for example, could know who done it. She knows who the bad guy is, but she can't exactly take the evidence she has, i.e., conversations with dead people, to the police. So has that dilemma. Um, it intrigued me, and I also like the idea of approaching it that the spirits of dead people are not necessarily scary. They are only as scary or friendly or helpful or annoying as the people were in real life, which I think is a more interesting spin than just assuming that ghosts without exception are all bad and to be avoided.
So how do you do your research?
Well, I hardly do any research for the ghosty parts because I just want to use my imagination for that. In fact, I sort of intentionally don't watch like ghost hunter shows or anything like that because I don't want to be tied to someone else's idea of how that works. Usually, my research is much more focused on the backstory or the things that are happening around Anne, independent of her communications with dead people.
But do you hear from clairvoyants who say, "Oh, you're getting it wrong"?
I have not actually. I have spoken with people, like a couple of people at book clubs and things like that, who have had experiences like a dead relative appeared to them, and they seem they seem not to be feeling like their experience is the only legitimate experience. Like
Mhm.
they've shared it with me in the sense of here's a way that I have a commonality with your protagonist, and I think you'd be interested in hearing it, not a critical, like, no, you got it wrong kind of approach.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's go to now. Close These Eyes. That's also Anne Kinnear. Am I right?
That is a short story that is based on Anne being in Mount Desert Island, Maine, which is one of my favorite places ever. Uh,
Uh-huh.
in January, which I was on MDI in January in Southwest Harbor, and people who know Southwest Harbor could probably read this story and guess what the actual location of the restaurant is that Anne is having dinner in when she sees some suspicious activity outside and follows a group of people down to the town dock where nefarious things occur.
And writing short stories is hard, or at least it's hard for me. But I get the impression that this is another comfort zone for you. Am I right?
It is. I think it's just a matter of how big a story do you bite off. And I started writing the short stories because I'd written two of the Anne Kinnear stories, The Sense of Death and The Sense of Reckoning. And then I had the idea for another story that was related to what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life, but it was a different kind of extraordinary ability that wouldn't really fit into Anne's world. And so that was the beginning of the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I thought it was just going to be one book. So I just told my Anne fans, just hold on a minute while I write this book. And then it turned out it was a trilogy. So I wrote the three Lizzie Ballard thrillers before I got back to Anne. But I wanted to give the Anne fans something to sort of tide them over. And so I started writing the short stories. And I think um, the approach to me is different in that when I'm motivated to write a short story, it's more because I have an idea for an action I want to pursue rather than a theme. So,
What do you mean
um,
in action? What do you mean in action?
well, like a good example is that in 2019, my husband and I went on a cruise that went around the Hawaiian Islands and then went to Vancouver. So we were at sea for a couple of days, and maybe it's a professional hazard that I started obsessing about what happens if somebody fell overboard.
Oh yeah.
So it was just a thing I wanted to write a story about, not kind of a thematic idea like one of my other books is more focused on the difference between profession and celebrity, and what do people at the top of um, their top of their business owe to the people who are following them, which was the kind of the theme behind the book, The Falcon and the Owl. But the stories are more like, oh, you know what would be fun? Is if somebody, Anne is on a boat where somebody falls overboard, or um,
Yeah, that'd be real fun.
we.
So it sounds like you use your writing to explore stuff.
Yeah, yeah, very much.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's talk about rock, paper, scissors and the Lizzie Ballard stuff. Let me just move to the next slide. We'll add it to the screen. Tell us more about Lizzie Ballard.
So Lizzie Ballard is a young lady, a very young lady. She's a little girl at the beginning of Rock Paper Scissors, and she also, like Anne Kinnear, has an extraordinary ability. And I always waffle about whether to say what the extraordinary ability is, but I'm just going to go ahead because it makes the conversation easier. It's a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I don't think too much of a spoiler. But as a result of her mother having received fertility treatments, Lizzie has the ability to cause strokes in other people, and
She has the ability to what?
cause strokes in people
Okay, that's what I
with the
thought you
power
said.
of her mind.
Oh
And
my.
so if she's upset or angry, this ability comes to the fore, and neither little Lizzie nor her parents realize this is happening, and can't understand why Lizzie's mother, although she's otherwise young and healthy, is starting to have small strokes. And so the early part of Rock, Paper, Scissors is about Lizzie's parents realizing what's going on and realizing that they both have to try to keep other people safe from their daughter and keep their daughter safe from people who would otherwise want to take advantage of her
And
ability.
it's almost, I mean, since this is something that's Lizzie is not aware of, it's if I'm not mistaken, and I probably am, this is almost like a metaphor for people finding their identity. Or am
Yeah.
I trying to go too deep on that?
Well, I think that it's something I'm sort of wrestling with the identity idea,
Mhm.
that it's not something that unlike Anne, where I think that her ability to communicate with dead people is very much a part of her identity.
Mhm.
And the fact that that ability is often not greeted with with belief among other people. There's a sort of a sub story in the first book about how she broke up with a longtime boyfriend because he thought she was crazy.
Mhm.
Um, for Lizzie, it's more of a condition, I guess, rather than an identity, and something that
Okay.
she
But it's still a discovery about oneself.
it's a discovery, absolutely, yeah. And the fact that her parents, when she's very young, have to kind of ease her into um, understanding the implications. And there's a scene in Rock, Paper, Scissors where her mother has taken her to the Poconos to a family cabin because that will, keep Lizzie safe and keep the people around her safe. And Lizzie's in the backyard. Her mom has let her, they found an old rotary lawnmower, and her mom's keeping an eye on her. Lizzie wants to mow the yard with a manual lawnmower, and she hits a nest of baby bunnies. And
Oh.
that's not only, traumatic as it would be for any child, but the mother sees the opportunity to say, obviously you didn't mean to do that. Obviously you feel horrible about it. Sometimes even when people have the best intentions, they can do terrible things. And that's her mother's way of kind of, expressing to Lizzie that she always has to be more careful than any other child about controlling her emotions and controlling her reactions to things. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the background on Lizzie.
Talk about the process. Writers and anybody who goes to a writers conference is always going to be asking. And as you and I go to writers conferences as speakers, we're asked, are you a planner or are you a pantser, a seat of the pantser? What are you?
Well, I am definitely more of a planner, and I have a goal of becoming even more of a planner, because if you're doing it and making a living at it, then efficiency counts. So, um, there was my fifth Anne Kinnear book was one where I wrote the manuscript. I got it all tidied up for my editor. I sent it to him, and he had a couple of um, one serious concern about character motivation, which was about a major character. And so I could figure out ways to fix it, but it really meant ripping and tearing a lot of the book because, as every change you make has a ripple effect across the entire remainder of the book. And there were even things like in the draft I gave my editor, I had a character who was pregnant, but just barely pregnant. So no one would know by looking at her that she was pregnant.
Mhm.
And then as I was working on the revisions, I realized it was going to be much more effective if she was very pregnant. And so I had to go find all those places where people
Right.
said like, You're pregnant? I would never have known. Because,
Right.
you have to
It's
clean that
just
up.
it's sprinkling those things in, but you
Yes.
gotta find the right places to do it. Is
Yep.
there a way that you stay organized so that you can easily find those places?
There is. I actually wrote in one of the articles I wrote for Writer's Digest is called Creating the Story Frame. And I based it on, I love the nautical metaphor for the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And see what I did there. And
Yeah. In fact,
so,
let's go solo so we can see better the nautical stuff in
yep,
the
I have
background.
my poster there of the sailboat. But there's really nothing about writing or publishing that doesn't have a fabulous analogy in the nautical world. And the analogy I really like for creating a story is that if you can focus on building the frame, putting the keel in and making sure overall what do you want? Do you want a canoe? Do you want a tugboat? Like, what are you going for? If you can hold off polishing the bright work until you have the frame in place, and then every step along the way is then you put the ribs on and you see whether the ribs are serving the purpose that you want for the boat. You put the planks on, and then eventually you're making it watertight. You're putting on the beautiful embellishments that will make it lovely to look at as it crosses the waves. And so I've developed some sort of mechanisms to do that, but that's my advice, that if efficiency is important, then it's better to have the frame in place before you start working on the fiddly stuff.
Do you find yourself doing seat of the pants writing anyway from time to time, or do you really stay away from that?
Um, I have never been a writer that's one of these, like, I wonder where my character is going to, I wonder who the murderer is. I just like, I know that is true for many, many writers who produce wonderful work, but it's just not how my brain works. But I have had the experience of putting together the frame, feeling like I had a good idea of where I was going with it, and then starting to write dialogue for a character and thinking, oh no, no, they would never say that, and having to rework, because I think dialogue gives you a whole different perspective on characterization, whereas framing is certainly more focused on the plot.
How long does it take you to write a novel?
It's usually uh, it's about 9 months. I think I've published a novel every year since 2013, which is when The Sense of Death came out. And it doesn't actually take me a year, but I must be doing other things during the other 3 months, because generally it's like a 9-month process.
Well, but then there's the rewrite process as well, and that's gonna take some
Oh,
time.
yeah. Yeah. That's the whole thing. So maybe like, oh, geez, I don't know. I should know this at this point, but maybe 5 months to have the product, and then 3 months, 3 or 4 months of revision.
Okay, so I definitely wanna get into podcasting, but before we do, I want to get a better sense of what you were doing before you decided to write full time.
Well, I was a project manager in the corporate world, many years in the IT area. So that was my background. That's probably why I'm very enthusiastic about
Very
framing things out and
organized.
planning.
Very
It's
organized,
yes,
yeah,
very organized. Um, yeah, so I had a good run in the corporate world. I mean, I know some people look back and just badmouth it, but I had many good experiences. I had some bad experiences too, so everybody does.
sure.
But certainly my corporate career gave me some nice financial runway when I decided that I wanted to be writing and podcasting full time.
How long was the corporate career?
Um, well, many decades until 2019.
Oh, are you ever discreet here?
I
Alright.
know. um,
Lots of experience. Was it
Lots of
was it
experience. Yeah.
was it hard to make the transition from, the day-to-day grind to doing something else?
I not not really. No. I mean, I loved that so much, and now I'm ruined. Like, I think not so much from
What do
writing
you
full
mean?
time.
What do you mean ruined?
Well, I could never go back to the corporate world, because after you work for yourself, I don't think you can ever work for anybody else again.
Yeah,
And I look back at the things that I had to put up with because it was somebody else calling the shots. And now that I'm calling the shots myself, I just think it would be hard to go back. But I've carried forward a lot of the discipline that I exercised in my corporate life. And there are more ways that you can tap into it. Certainly as a business owner, but even as an author, in terms of like making sure your ducks are in a row and things like that.
So talk now about podcasting. How did you get into that? Start with how you got into that. I'm remembering I teach a class on how to do an interview, and one of the cardinal mistakes is asking multi-part questions because then they can answer whatever they want. And
Oh, right.
right. And so talk about how you got into podcasting, and then I'll follow up.
Okay. Well, when I was early in my author career, so let's say 2013, 2014, I belonged to a local writers group called the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. And as I got to know the people in the group and understand what their areas of expertise were, I wanted an opportunity to talk to them in more detail about those things. So, as an example, there was somebody who was really excellent at giving author readings, and I wanted to talk more about that. There was somebody who was part of almost like a co-op of authors. They had several authors had come together to form a publishing company, and I was interested in that. There was somebody who had come from a media background and had kind of an area of expertise in media outreach for authors. And so I would talk to them, and kind of as a way to pay them back for the time they spent with me and to pay it forward to my fellow writers group members, I would record them and I would put them up as a podcast. So that was 2016, I guess, that I put out the first episode of the Indy Author Podcast. And then it was sort of sporadic for several years. And then when I left my job in 2016, I was able to go every other week, regularly every other week. And then in 2020, I think is when I went weekly. And it was still driven by the fact that I like to talk to people who were experts in things about writing and publishing. And then over time, I added some other goals like money. But yeah, just the opportunity to build a community, to share what you learn with other people is still certainly a driver of me continuing to do the podcast.
And so you've written a book on how to do this. Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about podcasting for authors.
Well, it's really a step-by-step. If people are thinking about podcasting, if they go to my website, which is the indyauthor.com, and it's Indy with a Y, I-N-D-Y, and there's a tab there that says, there you go, that says podcasting for authors. And if you scroll down on that page, there's something called the captain's log because, nautical metaphor. And it's the questions at the end of each chapter of Podcasting for Authors. And of course, I'd love it if you get the book to as a background to the questions, but I think people can really benefit a lot from the questionnaire. And it's basically walking through from the very most strategic considerations for starting a podcast to the most detailed. But the early chapters are focused on the idea that although I was never able to actually confirm this number, but I heard it so often, and it feels true to me that 70% of podcasts never get past the seventh episode. They pod fade. And so it is a huge time and effort and in some ways expense investment. And so I think that if people can think through in an organized way what they're hoping to gain, then they can first of all decide whether they want to embark on that voyage or if they want and then arrange the route they take based on the goals they have. If your goal is to start a podcast because you want to build up expertise in order to lead to speaking engagements, then that is going to be different than if you want to start a podcast because you're at home during COVID and you're an excellent interviewer and you want a chance to chat with people. And what route is going to match that goal best.
What do you know now about podcasting that you wish you'd known when you first started?
I would say what I know or what I wish I had known or what I wish I had done is to start simpler. And so the example that I always use for this is a transcript. So I use a software package called Descript that is great for non-audio and video editors because you feed a recording into it, it transcribes the audio into text, and then you can edit the text and it edits the audio and video. So if I say, I'm having a great time, Gary. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Then if I cut out the words, Gary, oops, sorry, from the text, it cuts it out of the audio and video as well. So it's
Well, but it's also going to be a jump cut for the video.
That is true. Yeah, one of the more detailed recommendations is you kind of have to pick what medium you're optimizing for. So I definitely optimize for audio, although I offer both audio and video. Um, but one thing you can do is you can export the transcript. You can export the text as a transcript, which is pretty good. It's probably better now. It is. I mean, it gets a little better every week probably, but it wasn't publishable. And so there was a period of time where I felt like I had committed to my listeners that I would provide a transcript. And then I was finding it was taking hours for me to edit a transcript. I might have a conversation that was 40 minutes, and then I would spend 3 hours editing the transcript, and it was 3 hours I wasn't writing. And
There you
writing
go.
is definitely, more of a moneymaker for me than my podcast is. So it wasn't, from a business point of view, a very good allocation of time. So I wish I had just not done the transcript until I was sure that I could do it and keep doing it. I eventually had to pull back from providing the transcript. But just recently, I found that if I take the text out of Descript and I feed it into ChatGPT, ChatGPT does a fabulous job of just cleaning up that stuff that I was spending 3 or 4 hours doing. And I can post some really nice transcripts now with not a ton of extra work. So
And of course, ChatGPT is basically pirating all of that material without paying you any copyright in royalties,
that
so
is
they can
true.
then use that and
But in that case,
see.
I'm willing to do it to save me 3 or 4 hours. Now, I can understand how people who are making actual money off that content, that's a painful reality for people to be facing.
How did you go about monetizing the podcast?
Well, I have a couple. The primary ways I monetize the podcast are patronage. So I do have a Patreon program for people
And
who
what does
want to.
that mean? How does that work?
It is you sign up as a member of a creative a creator. So if you were to go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, you would see several levels of monthly support. And different people approach it different ways. So for some people, it's just like, I want a way to acknowledge content that is otherwise being provided for free. That's kind of how I use it as a supporter. So there are
Mhm.
podcasts that I listen to, and I like to um, try to acknowledge the people who are doing that. So I might give a dollar, a couple of dollars a month to those people. There are other people who use Patreon much more, I guess, robustly, in the sense that they might offer much more elaborate bonuses for people. So there are people who will say, like, oh, if you pay me this amount a month, then I'll be sending you an article each month, or I'll send you special videos, or I'll get a t-shirt, or whatever that it might be. So
Mhm.
the way different people use Patreon is very different depending on what their business goals are. And then there's another monetization platform called Buy Me a Coffee, which is basically just, did you enjoy this podcast episode? You can buy me a coffee. And that's people, I think, in like $3 increments can buy you a virtual coffee. And that goes into the coffers as well, so to speak.
So if someone is thinking about starting a podcast, what are some of the tips that you have for how to get into it?
Well, the first thing is to make sure you really want to start a podcast. And so some of the early questions in this captain's log that I described are, um, what are well, one thing is, what is a good format that is going to match what you want to achieve? So, as an example, if you're uh, pursuing this goal of having a podcast to establish your expertise that would lead to speaking engagements, then maybe you want a solo show. If what you want to do is build a community, then a solo show is going to do that for you. You'd probably want an interview show. Do you want to share the work with another person? That might suggest that you want to do a show that has multiple hosts and one guest. So, thinking through the format, but I think almost more importantly, thinking through the um, the focus. So there's definitely a feeling among a lot of podcast experts that the more niched down you can make a podcast, the better. And so, there are podcasts that are about how to optimize the use of a particular writing tool. Um, And so if you think you might want to do that podcast, then the first thing I recommend is write down 24 topics that you would want to address
Mhm.
related to how to optimize your use of that writing tool. Because if you can't write down 24, you're going to poop out quickly.
Mhm.
Um, think about if you think you want to speak with guests, think about who those guests might be. But kind of trying to,
How difficult is it to get guests?
well, the more you do it, the easier it is to get the guests. And so, I started interviewing people that I knew personally from my local writers group. And, I had an established kind of a social credibility with them. So that was easy. And they appreciated the attention. Um, and then one of my recommendations is for each guest you have, consider who that person might want to provide or who you might want to ask that person to provide an invitation or an introduction to. And
Uh-huh.
so, I'm not suggesting that people be too mercenary about who they pick for their guests, but if I have, an editor on the podcast and I know that they're an editor for a certain writer that I want to speak to, then I'll ask for an introduction. And, each time you do that, the pool of people you can tap into gets bigger and bigger.
What have you learned about interviewing over the years?
Um, I've learned that I have to be careful of my posture. This was so funny because I'm trying to very
You
intentionally
slump? Are you a slumper?
I do this because
Oh.
I'll be listening to someone, and the more I listen to them, the more I lean forward and I do this. And yes, it makes it look like I'm about to argue with them about something. And that took me a long time to notice that I was doing that, and then even longer time to try to address. Um, I think another thing is just trying to make it conversational and not try to steer interviewees away from giving a presentation.
Right.
Um, and I think the most important, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this, is letting the conversation going where the conversation is taking you. So not kind of marching through a list of bullet points. And I was just interviewing someone about branding today, and she had sent, a list of like 6 bullet points related to branding. What is branding for authors? How can you brand? What are the characteristics of a good brand? And we got started talking about how branding is way beyond just like a recognizable book cover. It's your whole persona. And so we were started talking about like uh, how everything you do that's public facing is part of your brand, but your public facing persona doesn't have to be it has to be authentic, but it doesn't have to be your actual private person.
Mhm.
And so that was a conversation I would never have thought to write down and then discuss with her how, the persona is a part of branding, but it was just such a fascinating conversation.
It sounds like, I mean, some of this has to do with temperament, I would think. I mean, some shy or introverted people may have a more difficult time podcasting than, say, an extrovert, or am I wrong?
Well, I think it depends on the approach you take. So I would probably not recommend that an introverted person try to do a solo podcast. I don't want to listen to myself talk for 45 minutes. It's just like that doesn't feel comfortable to me, nor does it sound interesting to me. But an introverted person might be a very good interviewer because they're focused on turning the attention to the person they're talking with. So I don't think introvert or extrovert is necessarily more or less well equipped. It's just the approach you take is going to be more or less successful.
Okay, okay. Fascinating. You're a fabulous writer, and the interesting thing about your writing is that, you can paint a pretty nefarious villain, but you're such a nice person. Where's all this evil coming from?
You get it all out, isn't it? Don't they say like horror writers are the nicest people because they're like expending all that otherwise evil stuff. But yes, my husband likes to tell the story of going to actually I'm playing this is what I like futz with when I'm talking. Um
Hold it up. Show
it's like it's a little pebble,
Okay.
and I got it at a place called Hunter's Beach on Mount Desert Island. And I thought of it because just coincidentally most of the many of the pebbles are that size, but many of them are big. And we were walking around. My husband said, "This would be great in like the border of a garden or something like that." I said, "Yes, and it's just the right size. You could pick it up and hit somebody over the head with it."
At least you said it out loud,
Yes,
so
that's right.
he's at least been warned.
Say it loud and proud.
So what are you working on now, and what's coming up next for you?
I am working on the fourth Lizzie Ballard book. And also, sort of at the same time, I'm working on a Lizzie Ballard novella because at the end of book 3, which is called The Iron Ring, what happens to the protagonist, Lizzie, could happen days, weeks, even months later. But what happens to the bad guy, Louise, is going to happen clearly seconds after book 3 ends. And so I planned to pick that up in book 4, but then I was in the situation where I was trying to sync the Lizzie timeline and the Louise timeline, and the only way I could do it was to have like 7 chapters of Louise before we got to Lizzie, which wasn't working. So I finally
Right.
had the idea of doing a novella that's specifically on the bad guy of the Lizzie Ballard thrillers to catch her up with what's going on with Lizzie. So so that should be out. The novella should be out before the end of the year, and then Lizzie Ballard book 4 should be out early next year.
Well, and that gives we really haven't explored this, but I mean, basically you are self-published. You
Yes.
have your own. In fact, let me bring this up if I can find it. Yes, your imprint is William Kingfield Publishers, which is named after your dad.
Yeah.
And so how did you come about to come up with your own publishing imprint? How did that work?
Well, when I was finishing The Sense of Death in 2013, I started speaking through the Brandywine Valley Writers Group and other writers groups I knew about. I was talking to other people, other writers who were traditionally published, and asking them about the experience. And this was in 2013 when it was a better situation for traditionally published authors then. And even then, I was like, you're giving away the creative control, and in a lot of cases, money for not a lot of support. And I boiled it down to, it took me a while to boil it down this way, but I boiled it down to um, traditional publishing gives you the A and B, which is access in terms of a traditionally published author is more likely, not guaranteed to, but more likely to see their book in a Barnes and Noble than I will.
Right.
And bragging rights, because it's super cool to be able to say that you're published by, whoever Hachette or, fill in the
Mhm.
blank. But that against that, indie
C,
publishing. I'm sorry?
the C is control, right?
Well, the C is there are 3 Cs. Actually, sometimes there are 4 Cs. So
Right.
control is definitely one. Um, I'm never gonna have a book cover I hate. Creativity, I don't have to be creative on somebody else's schedule. Care, by which I mean care of the backlist, and that is that no traditional publisher would still be promoting a book that was 10 years old, but
Right.
I'm always gonna be promoting the first Ann Kinnear book because I want people to read through. And then cash. I mean, I had come up with those 3 Cs, and then I was talking to a traditionally published author, and she said, "Oh, but you should include cash too, because in many cases, like you hear about the big multi-million dollar deals, but in many cases, indie authors are making more money than traditionally published authors." So, yeah.
Is there a downside though to self-publishing?
Well, I think the downside is that you have to approach it as a business as well as a creative endeavor.
Right.
There are just some people who do not want to deal with the back office stuff, and if you don't wanna do that, then, a traditional publisher will take care of that for you.
What do you mean back office stuff?
Paying taxes and, balancing the books and, all those sort of businessy things that,
The
otherwise.
tedium, the
Yeah,
tedium, yeah.
yeah.
And is there a lot? I mean, what percentage of your
Well,
day is dealing with that kind of stuff?
well, fortunately, not as much as it used to be because I actually finally hired somebody to do the finances for me. I'm definitely a numbers person. I mean, a word person, not a numbers person.
Right.
And I had a long, long time friend who worked in finance her whole career. And when she retired, I said, "Can you please just take care of this for me?" And it was great because I could just turn all my accounts. So, I totally trust her. She's been my best friend for many years. And so she just takes care of all that. So I've spent much less time on that than I used to. But, there's the where am I going to promote? Where am I going to market? Is it time to recover my books? All those other questions. If that isn't fun for you, then there's no harm in pursuing a traditional deal. But I think the kicker is you don't get to decide to be traditionally published. You get to decide to try.
Uh-huh.
So
Have you thought at all lately about giving that a try just to see what it would be like? or are you pretty much locked in happily to what you're doing?
Well, I would never say never, but I think that in reality, for me to consider a traditional publishing deal, it's unlikely. It would have to be so good that I don't think in reality any traditional publisher is going to offer me what I would require. And I did actually, I wrote a standalone uh, that should also be coming out next year. Um, and I thought, not only are access and bragging rights fun, but it would be cool as somebody who writes, speaks, consults, and podcasts about writing and publishing to have a direct view of both sides. And so I
Right.
did go through the exercise of, pitching at a couple of pitch fests at conferences, and it was just soul killing. Like, I don't really need somebody telling me that they don't know what shelf to put my book on.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that pretty much ended that path for me.
Okay, okay. Anything else that you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked?
Um, I think the only thing I can think of, and I always seize the opportunity when I have it, is why I say indie publishing and not self-publishing.
Oh, please.
So I discourage people from saying self-publishing because I think it suggests that you're doing everything yourself. And really, professional publishers, I should say, professional indie authors should not be like making their own book covers or things like that. Like, there are just some things that you need to enlist a team for, primarily book cover design and editorial. But I think that by saying indie publishing, it's kind of like indie movies. You would never say he self-produced the movie. No,
Right,
you
right.
say it was an indie movie because there's an understanding that it's a team of people. It's a business. It's both a creative endeavor and a business endeavor. And I think that it's not necessarily a publishing route question. Like, even the most successful traditionally published authors are those that have indie mindset, um, in the sense that they're willing to take on a more holistic view of what they're doing than
Boy,
focusing specifically on the
what
creative aspect.
what you've done is really, I think, and very succinctly explained the difference, and it's a nuanced difference between self-publishing and indie publishing. It
Yeah.
really, even though they're the same thing, indie, I think, the way you've explained it in a way I'd never heard before makes so much sense because it's independent,
Yeah.
and it's not just you and your little bubble.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Okay. So people can get in touch with you in two ways. One is through the indieauthor.com, and I would imagine that has a portal for, contacting you.
Yes, it does.
And then there's also your name, mattydalrymple.com, and
Yeah.
it's DALRYMPLE. And this has been so much fun.
Yeah, it
I
has been.
Thank you. I'm
Thank you.
John DeDakis. You've been one-to-one with me, and I've been one-to-one with Matty Dalrymple. Matty, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.